There's a silence growing in the world, a strange, almost sacred silence that few can hear. It's the sound of the most awakened minds slowly moving away from the human noise. They don't announce their departure. They don't publish manifestos. They don't raise flags. They simply disappear. They log off social media, end projects, and distance themselves from conversations that once seemed important. They leave stable jobs, comfortable relationships, noisy groups. They choose silence. A place of constant presence, a discreet yet meaningful emptiness emerges. This movement isn't born of ordinary weariness, something deeper, an inner impulse that seems to come from another dimension of consciousness. Napoleon Hill would call it the call of mental mastery, the moment when the individual awakens to the silent power that governs all things. Hill said, "There is an invisible line that separates the common man from the awakened man. Before crossing it, we live like cogs within a collective mechanism. We think like the crowd, feel like them, suffer and desire at the same frequencies. But when consciousness awakens, this cog becomes a prison. Conversations seem empty, opinions repeat themselves, time accelerates without direction. Something inside the mind begins to say, this is no longer for you." Not arrogance, vibrational incompatibility. The being begins to realize that everything noisy, superficial, and automatic drains, and then the first impulse to withdraw arises. Hill saw this impulse as an unmistakable sign of spiritual growth. The soul, tired of reacting to the world, begins to seek the power that creates it. But this awakening isn't sweet. It requires courage to face the discomfort of emptiness, the fear of losing belonging, the silence that reveals who we truly are. When Hill spoke of the greatest secret of the mind, he wasn't referring to material wealth, talking about the moment when a being realizes all creative power arises from disciplined and solitary. The awakened person needs isolation to reorganize their mental frequency, like an alchemist who needs fire and solitude to transform raw metal into gold. This is why, to the common eye, the conscious appear to be giving up on social life. But in truth, they are merely exchanging noise for attunement. They are learning to listen to the infinite mind, the invisible field from which all creation springs. Have you ever felt this impulse? The sudden urge to disappear, silent, to blot out the noise and listen to something you can't. Hill would say, this is universal intelligence itself, trying to manifest itself. It's the force of the invisible, asking for space to act. But the paradox is cruel. The more conscious you become, the harder it is to remain among the small talk becomes unbearable. Empty discussions sound like mental noise, and every social setting demands that you dim your light to fit in. Hill called this the betrayal of high thought, the moment when the mind trained to create must pretend not to know, just to be accepted. And it is at this point that true withdrawal begins. People think isolation is loneliness, but for the awakened, it is liberation. Silence becomes companionship, introspection, dialogue with the infinite. Hill said that the truly conscious person needs no witnesses. He understands that life's greatest movements happen without applause. Just as a seed grows into a tree deep within the earth, inner growth happens far from the eyes of others. Modern society, obsessed with visibility and validation, doesn't understand this process. This is why it labels withdrawal as weakness, surrender, or eccentricity. But Hill saw exactly the opposite. Withdrawal is not escape, it preparation. It is the stage in which the mind abandons its dependence on external influences and begins to generate reality from within. However, there is pain in this journey. The awakening of consciousness brings not only light, but also a confrontation with one's own shadows. Hill warned, before controlling the external world, a man must master the empire within. Mastering the inner self means confronting thoughts that previously went unnoticed. The fear of rejection, the need for approval, the attachment to social image. Each of these attempts to pull the awakened person back into the collective. It is a silent struggle between the old and the new, between the comfort of the known and the call of the unseen. And the more one tries to resist, the more the mind fragments. The only way is to surrender to silence, to accept that solitude is not a punishment, but a gateway. Hill believed there comes a point in the journey when consciousness no longer fits within the framework. He called it the overflow point. It's when the individual begins to realize that their mind is not just a container for thoughts, but a creative force connected to something greater. And when this happens, everything changes. What once felt like success now rings hollow. Once felt like progress, now distraction. Old ambitions lose their flavor. What remains is the search for inner harmony, the alignment of thought, emotion, and purpose. And it is precisely at this point that many disappear. Not because they have lost their way, but because they have found a path that cannot be followed as a group. Society, driven by haste and repetition, does not understand the language. For it, silence is suspect, attachment is threat, and a deep gaze is comfortable. But Hill knew that the true master is never immediate. He said, The mind that learns to think for itself becomes invisible to the common eye. Invisible, but not inactive. On the contrary, more active than ever, only in another dimension, more subtle and creative. The one who withdraws begins to operate in silence, using the power of concentrated thought to shape realities that noise could never. And while the world screams, he observes. While others vie for visibility, he polishes clarity. While the masses seek followers, he seeks meaning. This is why, in this time when everyone talks, wise remains silent. The global noise is merely a reflection of a humanity afraid to listen to its own mind. And it is in this chaos that Hill's teachings become compass. Controlled thought is the highest form of prayer. What he meant is that true transformation does not occur on the surface of words, but in the inner vibration that each thought emits. When the mind achieves this mastery, it no longer needs the approval of others because it recognizes that everything out there is merely a projection, vibrates with it. The silence that Hill preached is not the absence of sound, but presence of consciousness. It is the mind that withdraws to hear what the world cannot say. And whoever reaches this point can no longer return to the old rhythm, participating in collective illusions, painful, not out of moralism, out of lucidity. The vibration of unconsciousness weighs heavy. The noise of appearances hurts, and the need to conform to common thinking becomes a form of spiritual violence. So the individual takes a step back, an invisible but decisive step, and in doing so, a new kind of existence begins. Silent on the outside, infinite on the inside. Napoleon Hill would say that this is precisely where man finds the gold he has always sought. Not the gold that shines in the vaults, that which shines in the gold of clarity, of self-sufficiency, inner mastery. It is the beginning of the journey to the master mind, that state in which the individual understands that reality does not control him, but responds to him. And to achieve this, one must first disappear. Disappear from expectations, from noise, from distractions. It is not escape, a return to the center, where everything begins. The world does not understand those who withdraw, but the universe recognizes. The silence of the awakened is the prelude to a new collective consciousness. And while the rest still seek attention, they learn to cultivate presence. While the world runs in circles, they learn to spiral, ascending, expanding, transcending. Disappearance is merely the disguise of evolution. Hill called this the test of the initiate, stage where life asks, want to remain part of the noise? Or do you want to become the mind that creates it? Answer lies in silence, and whoever listens to it is never the same again. Have you ever felt like you're living inside a theater? That the people around you seem to play such convincing roles that for a moment you almost forget their pretend? Napoleon Hill said this is the first symptom of the awakened mind, the sudden realization that most people live automatically, obeying ideas, emotions, and beliefs that aren't their own. It's like waking up in the middle of a play and realizing the script was written by someone you've never met. At first, this realization feels liberating, soon becomes a burden, because seeing the truth requires bearing the weight of seeing what others don't yet see. Imagine being in a room full of people laughing, talking, living, and suddenly you realize something is off. The words sound rehearsed, the gestures repetitive, the smiles automatic. There's an invisible pattern guiding every movement. You try to participate, but something inside you can know. You feel like everything is noise. There's a deeper meaning hidden behind appearances. Hill called this moment the shock of lucidity, the instant when a person realizes they are no longer part of the game, but an observer of the board. This shock is intense because it shatters the illusion of belonging. Suddenly, the world seems distant. Everyday conversations, goals, debates, common concerns, all seem part of the same spectacle. Collective consciousness acts knowingly. The awakened mind begins to see the invisible gears, how fear manipulates decisions, search for approval drives behaviors, how the desire for power disguises insecurity. Hill said that society is driven by unconscious mental forces that most mistake for freedom. Awakening reveals that almost no one truly chooses, react, believing they're in control. At first, those who awaken try to share what they've discovered. They want to show others that there's something beyond, that there's a different way of living and perceiving. But they soon realize that language isn't enough. Words aren't enough to convey inner clarity. It's like trying to explain the sea to someone who's never seen water. The awakened mind speaks from within the silence, while others listen from within the noise. An invisible distance emerges, impossible to cross without losing what has been achieved. It is then that the awakened one begins to fall silent, not out of surrender, but out of respect for their own conscience. Hill said that wisdom doesn't need to convince. It expresses itself through the energy of those who live it. Hill once told the story of a businessman who, after years of success, began to feel a strange repulsion for everything that had previously motivated him. Meetings tired him, goals seemed pointless, praise rang hollow. He tried to hide his discomfort, but his body reacted. Insomnia, irritation, a feeling of emptiness. He sought out doctors, psychologists, friends. No one understood. Until, silently, he realized the problem wasn't the world. It was his new consciousness trying to free itself from its old self. Hill explained to him that this discomfort is natural. When thinking expands, it no longer fits within the structures that once supported it. What was once comfortable becomes a prison, and what was once accepted becomes impossible to tolerate. This process is invisible, but profoundly real. The awakened person begins to see the collective shadows, same ones Hill described as mental masses operating without direction. They see how groups attack each other, each believing themselves to be on the right side, unaware that both project their own darkness. They perceive how social media transforms pain into spectacle, how politics becomes a war of egos, how faith becomes an instrument of fear. All of this is projection, the collective unconscious trying to cope with what it refuses to see within. Hill understood that this mechanism was inevitable, but he also knew that the conscious individual can no longer participate in it without harming their own soul. Shock becomes unbearable. The awakened mind realizes that the world is sick, but the sickness is invisible. It's unconsciousness disguised as normality. It asks itself, is it worth staying here? Is it worth pretending not to see? As the answer comes like a silent wave, no. Hill said this is the point at which the individual stops living by influence and begins to live by purpose. They stop reacting to what the world imposes and begin to create what the spirit demands. It's an internal rupture, turning point. Life ceases to be linear and becomes vertical instead of following the flow. It ends. But there is loneliness on this. The awakened one realizes clarity separates him. There is no crowd at the top of the mountain. There is wind, silence, and bear. He misses company, but knows he cannot. He tries to return to ordinary life, but everything seems superficial. Conversations revolve in circles. Relationships seem like a repetition of old lessons. It's like trying to breathe in an airless room. So he begins to withdraw, first physically, then emotionally. He begins to observe more and speak less. His gaze becomes deeper, his gestures more. He is transforming, even if the world doesn't notice. Hill explained that this transformation is the birth of true mental power. The mind, once reactive, now becomes creative. Silence is not empty, it is a laboratory. In this state, ideas arrive with almost divine clarity. Intuition becomes clear, coincidences increase, answers appear at the right time. The awakened person begins to understand that there is an order behind the apparent chaos, an intelligence guiding the process. They understand that nothing they experienced was in vain. All the losses, rejections, and ruptures were merely life's invisible method of pushing them toward their own. And then an unexpected shift emerges. Suffering begins to dissolve. What was once anguish is now lucidity. What was once fear is now understanding. The awakened realize they're not being punished. Hill said that the universe never takes anything without offering something greater in return, but to receive, one must first empty oneself. Therefore, withdrawal becomes inevitable. The individual needs space to reorganize mind, to allow the new frequency to stabilize. It is during this period that many withdraw from public life, move cities, break cycles, and disappear from social media. It is not a rejection of the world. It is a reconfiguration of one's own energy. However, there is something mysterious about this. The further the awakened individual moves away, the more they feel the presence of something greater guiding their steps. Hill called this infinite intelligence, the universal force that responds when the human mind aligns with it. Small coincidences begin to happen. The right people appear. Doors open effortlessly. Life begins to flow with almost supernatural. The individual discovers that control comes not from force, harmony. And they realize that true freedom has never been found in the world, but in the ability to keep the mind awake while the world sleeps. But not everyone understands this state. Society, unable to recognize silence as power, judges the awakened as someone who has lost their way. They say they have become strange, cold, distant. They fail to understand that they have simply stopped vibrating at the same level. They have not become superior, they have become conscious. Hill said that the mind awakened to truth needs no defense. Time will do its translation, and indeed, time reveals everything. What seemed isolation turns out to be strengthening. What seemed loss becomes purpose. It is at this point that Hill's man is completely transformed. He is no longer part of the crowd, but neither is he its enemy. He stands on the threshold between the old and the new, between the visible and the invisible, between the roaring world and the silence it creates. He realizes that true power lies not in convincing anyone, but in sustaining one's own clarity amidst the collective confusion. And he understands that, from that point on, his journey will no longer be outward, but inward. This is the beginning of second awakening. The moment when the mind realizes that its function is not to resist the world, but to understand it to the point of transcending its law. Hill said that the conscious mind becomes an energetic anomaly, a being that vibrates outside the norm of the masses, and therefore begins to attract a new reality, silent, authentic, and creative. It is no longer the same, and the world somehow begins to change around it. The initial shock turns to understanding, discomfort turns to lucidity, and the silence, once frightening, reveals itself as fertile ground. It is here that the awakened understand what Hill meant when he wrote, "The mind that sees truth can no longer feign ignorance. The veil has fallen. The stage has vanished. Now there is no turning back." There comes a point in the journey of consciousness where the brilliance of lucidity becomes a burden. After awakening, one begins to see too much. Nothing is as it seems. Every gesture carries a hidden intention. Every word carries a spoken motive. Every system reveals a web of invisible manipulations. Napoleon Hill described this stage as the burden of discernment, the moment when the individual realizes that knowledge is also a mirror that cannot be broken. The awakened mind begins to see the collective shadows that sustain the illusion. It sees the ego wars disguised as ideologies, the vanities disguised as virtue, the power games that hide under the name of progress. And the more clarity one achieves, the harder it is to remain blinded by convenience. Hill used to say that the enlightened mind stops reacting and begins to understand. But understanding the collective unconscious is like looking directly at the sun. Too much light burns. This is when many awakened people feel the urge to retreat, not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. Being among the unconscious becomes a form of psychic pain. They realize that the energy spent trying to explain what they see is futile, because the world doesn't want to understand, wants to continue believing. They choose silence, a dense, fertile silence that holds the power of pure observation. They'll believe that in this silence, the mind doesn't become passive, but reorganizes itself to comprehend what lies beyond appearances. What seemed like escape is, in fact, the beginning of wisdom. But then, an inevitable question arises. Is it possible to continue loving the world after seeing its contradictions? Is it possible to live among people without being swept away by their projections? This is the test of true awakening. The awakened mind must learn to coexist with unconsciousness without being contaminated by it. Hill saw this as an exercise in mental mastery, maintaining one's own frequency when everything around vibrates in. He said that the master does not escape the world, he transcends it in silence. This transcendence is not physical, but vibrational. The individual remains present, but on another inner plane, observing without getting involved, understanding without reacting. However, this neutrality exacts a price. The awakened one begins to realize that every human relationship contains an invisible energetic exchange. Words, glances, tensions, everything is an electric current. And when most of these currents are driven by unconsciousness, the result is draining. Hill called this psychological vampirism. The awakened mind, more sensitive and open, captures what others don't yet perceive. The tension hidden in the fear disguised as laughter, the insecurity camouflaged as it's a reading that can't be turned off. That's precisely why awakening. The body reacts to what the spirit feels. The simple act of being in a dense environment begins to demand enormous physical effort, like trying to breathe in a room without oxygen. Have you ever felt exhausted for no apparent reason? As if something invisible was draining your energy, even in simple situations. Hill would say, this isn't weakness, it's heightened sensitivity. The awakened mind isn't sick, it simply perceives what others ignore. The problem is that this perception can't be turned off, it becomes constant. And when the world doesn't change, the only way is to change the way we are. Then comes selective withdrawal. Less superficial interaction, less stimuli, less. The awakened person begins to choose precisely where they place their attention, because they understand that attention is the currency of consciousness. Where it is spent, energy flows. And wasting energy on the unconscious is like trying to fill a leak up. At this stage, many feel guilty. They think they are isolating themselves, becoming cold or distant. But Hill said that true responsibility lies not with the world, but with one's own mental state. You cannot enlighten anyone if you extinguish yourself, asserted. Withdrawal, therefore, is not disinterest, it is preparation. The conscious being understands that they can only serve humanity when they're whole. For that, everything is noise. This is why withdrawal is sacred. It is the moment when one reconnects with the source from which all clarity emanates. And the longer one remains in this state, the more one realizes that solitude is not the absence of, but the presence of consciousness. But something curious happens in the process. The further the awakened person distances themselves from the crowd, the more they begin to see the hidden beauty of the what once seemed like chaos now reveals itself as a dance between light and shadow, ignorance and learning. Hill believed that even the collective unconscious serves an evolutionary function. He said that humanity sleeps because it must dream its fears before it can awaken from them. This understanding transforms judgment into action. The awakened person stops condemning unconsciousness and begins to observe it with serenity. They understand that each person has the level of consciousness they're capable of sustaining. No one awakens prematurely, and no one remains asleep forever. But what to do while the world sleeps? This is the question that echoes among the awakened. Wait? Teach? Disappear? Hill answered with a paradox. Keep growing. Your example is the only teaching the unconscious recognizes. He knew that vibration is more convincing than speech. When someone truly transforms, the environment feels it. It is not what is said, but what one is. Fires change. That is why the awakened, though invisible, is constantly. Their silent presence alters the surrounding field. It is like a discreet flame that warms the air unseen. Even distant, even silent, it guides. However, there is a subtle trap in this new clarity: spiritual pride. Hill warned that many confuse awareness with superiority. They think seeing more makes them better. But true awakening doesn't create hierarchy, it creates humility. A mind that perceives the whole understands that every being, even the most unconscious, is an expression of the same energy field. No one is above, only at different stages of perception. Hill said that the wise man does not look from above, looks from within. This is the antidote to arrogant isolation. The awakened one doesn't withdraw because he believes himself better, but because he knows he must tend to the inner fire before the wind of the collective extinguishes it. Have you ever noticed how the silence of truly wise people carries more power than 1,000? Hill believed that this silence is the language of the higher mind. In it, there is no need to prove anything, because the truth is already self-evident. It is the same silence that precedes creation, the interval between thought and manifestation. In this invisible space, we can begin to understand the mechanics of the universe. Everything is vibration, and vibration is shaped by the quality of thought. This understanding changes everything. The world ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a field of possibility. The focus shifts from what is wrong to what can be created. And when this shift occurs, something unexpected arises: gratitude. The awakened individual begins to be grateful even for the shadows that once tormented them, because they understand that without them, they would never have learned to see. The shadow is not the enemy, it is the backdrop that allows us to see the light. Hill said that the wise mind is one that recognizes, even in chaos, hidden workings of order. From then on, the individual stops fighting unconsciousness and begins to live in harmony with the process. They become a point of balance between worlds, the old, which still sleeps, and the new, which slowly awakens. In the end, the true paradox of awakening reveals itself. The same gaze that once saw the world as a prison now sees it as a learning ground. The same silence that once seemed solitude, now communion with the whole. And the same detachment that seemed like renunciation, now a gesture of love. Because the awakened understand that they can only offer light when their own flame is stable. Hill called this creative consciousness a state in which humankind finally understands that they need not change. They need only be the purest reflection of the mind that creates. In that instant, everything changes effortlessly. There comes a time when the awakened realize that their mind no longer accepts the same role it once played. Social masks begin to fall, one by one, until none of them fit their face anymore. This is the beginning of what Napoleon Hill called the crisis of authenticity. Silent collapse between who a person is, who the world expects them to remain. This is the point at which many, without understanding the process, believe they are losing their way. In fact, they are getting closer to their own truth. The social persona, carefully constructed over the years, becomes too heavy. The automatic smile begins to hurt. Superficial praise no longer nourishes. Success, once a symbol of achievement, reveals itself as a gilded prison. Hill said that the price of authenticity is dissolution of illusions, and that few are prepared to pay it. Transformation is subtle, but inevitable. People who were always extroverted begin to seek silence. Conversations become shorter but deeper. Noisy environments cause discomfort. A desire to simplify everything arises: work, routine, relationships. It's as if something within the being screams for space. Hill explained that the awakened mind, when in conflict with a false environment, enters an energetic collapse. He recounted cases of successful business people who suddenly began experiencing unexplained symptoms: chronic fatigue, anxiety, dizziness, constant feeling of exhaustion. Doctors found nothing. But, in long conversations, Hill perceived the pattern. These were men and women living identities that no longer corresponded to their truth. The body screamed what the mind refused to acknowledge. No enlightened mind can live long in an environment of falsehood without becoming ill, he once said. In one of his lesser-known stories, Hill told the story of a teacher who, after years of dedication, began to feel repulsed by her own routine. She loved teaching. Something inside her had changed. School corridors seemed increasingly oppressive. The educational system felt like a machine that was extinguishing her creative mind. She began to fall ill. The headaches became constant, and fatigue prevented her from completing her classes. When she sought help, Hill advised her to stop completely. She was frightened. How could she abandon everything? But he insisted, "You're not sick. You're being called to transformation." She then retreated to a small house in the mountains without a phone, without commitments. For weeks, she simply slept and walked in silence. Gradually, her energy returned, and with it, a new vision of teaching. When she returned years later, she created a completely different method, centered on self-knowledge. Hill said that this was the true miracle of the mind. It becomes ill when it lives outside of purpose and heals itself when it returns to the natural flow of consciousness. The phenomenon is more common than one might imagine. Today, psychologists would call it burnout, existential depression, but Hill already understood it as a breakdown between the real self and the projected self. He observed that modern societies have created a system that rewards performance, not consciousness. From an early age, we are trained to perform, not to be. We work to please, compete to prove, accumulate to fulfill, until the day comes when the mind can no longer bear the falsehood. And the symptom of this exhaustion is not weakness, but awakening. Hill asserted that the true sign of spiritual evolution is the inability to continue playing roles that do not correspond to the authentic self. When the individual reaches this point, they feel something invisible pushing them out of old structures. It is the beginning of the call to creative isolation. But there's an intriguing contradiction. The more a person tries to resist change, the more suffering increases. It's like rowing against an invisible current. Hill said that resistance to transformation is torment, and it's in this process that many experience loss. Friends drift away, opportunities disappear, doors close. The world seems to punish the awake when in fact it's only paving the way. Life removes what is incompatible with the new level of consciousness, Hill wrote. This simple and direct phrase carries a profound meaning. Consciousness doesn't destroy, it cleanses. And what humans interpret as failure is liberation. Have you ever felt like something you considered essential simply lost its meaning overnight? As if the energy that once kept you motivated had nipped in the bud. Hill would say this is the clearest sign that the cycle has ended. He compared the awakened mind to a snake shedding its skin. The process is uncomfortable but necessary. The old layer must shed so the new can breathe. And curiously, this process happens with almost mathematical synchronicity. Hill observed that many awakened ones reported unlikely events during this transition. Chanced encounters, coincidences, vivid dreams, precise intuitions. It's as if the universe conspired to accelerate change. The right people appear at exactly the right information emerges from nowhere. Previously confusing decisions become obvious. Hill saw this as the silent work of infinite intelligence, adjusting external circumstances to the individual's new internal state. One of the most striking accounts came from an American engineer who, after decades at a large corporation, decided to abandon everything, move to the countryside. In the process, he lost his job, friends, and status. He was judged irresponsible. But a few months later, an old hobby building small electrical devices began to root. One of his homemade projects eventually became a successful commercial product. When Hill interviewed him, I have lost everything that made me, but I have found what makes me live. Hill wrote in his diary, consciousness reveals the new purpose only after the old is undone. Emptiness is the interval of creation. It is at this point that the awakened person understands that it wasn't the world that became unbearable. It was they who became truer. Truth, though liberating, requires space. Hill believed that the human mind is like a precision instrument, more refined, more sensitive to know. An awakened mind suffers not because it is weak, but because it perceives what was previously invisible. This heightened perception is what makes the awakened person naturally withdraw from false environments. They don't need to decide. The body decides for them. The feeling of heaviness, fatigue, or discomfort is how consciousness communicates. This is no longer your play. And ignoring this warning is like trying to breathe under. What happens when the awakened one finally gives in and the world, accustomed to noise, misses his presence? People seek him out, ask what's wrong, try to bring him back to the ordinary rhythm. He then realizes he's become a stranger to his own surroundings. The awakened mind no longer fits in shallow conversations, trivial disputes, or the goals of others. Hill said that the greatest loneliness is not to be alone, but to be awake among those who sleep. This phrase defines the crossing. The awakened one learns to live on the threshold, visible but not accessible, present but distant. Little by little, he begins to rebuild a simpler, more coherent, quieter life. He discovers that true freedom lies not in doing what he wants, but in no longer needing what is non-essential. Then the unexpected happens. Just when he believes he has distanced himself from the world, life begins to restore everything he had lost, albeit transformed. New relationships emerge, now based on authenticity. New opportunities appear, now aligned with purpose. Energy returns, are stable, clearer. Hill called this stage the re-established mind, the moment when the individual rediscovers the creative flow. He no longer seeks approval, fears rejection, or negotiates his own truth. He learns to be whole, even amidst chaos. Curiously, it is at this stage that he once again influences the world, not through force, but through presence. There is something profoundly poetic about this cycle. Man disappears from the noise only to reappear. Hill said that he who masters his own silence earns the respect of the universe. Paradox. Stepping off the stage becomes more relevant than ever. His absence creates presence. His stillness inspires movement. His example awakens others without him needing to say a word. This is how awakening spreads, not by doctrine, resonance. Each mind that frees itself creates a new possibility in the realm. And little by little, the invisible begins to change the visible. In the end, it seemed like a loss. The crisis of authenticity is merely the gateway to freedom. Hill wrote that the mind that learns to live in coherence becomes immune to manipulation. Perhaps this is the greatest power of all, the ability to remain whole in a fragmented world. When the awakened understand this, they no longer fear solitude, change, certainty. They understand that the path was planned by the very intelligence that is them. And in that instant, silence ceases to be the sound of creation. There comes a moment when silence becomes a mirror, and the awakened person realizes they're no longer merely observing the world from the outside. They are beginning to see their own reflection within. It is at this point that solitude ceases to be an escape and becomes a transformation. Napoleon Hill said this is the most dangerous and most powerful stage of the journey. The moment when the mind comes into direct conflict with all that remains of unconsciousness within itself. There are no more distractions, no noise, no excuses, only the echo of one's own thoughts. It is a plunge few can endure, because silence is not only calm, it reveals. What is revealed within is not always pretty. During this phase, many feel as if they are regressing. Old emotions return with force, forgotten memories emerge, desires and fears that seemed overcome return in shadow form. He'll describe this as psychic purification, an inevitable process in which the mind eliminates the excess accumulated by conscious experiences. What society calls an emotional crisis, Hill saw as a ritual of creation. The mind needs to release what no longer serves it in order to expand. It's like a river that needs to flood before finding a new course. The individual feels vulnerable, confused, sometimes on the verge of giving up, but it is precisely there, in this apparent inner chaos, that consciousness is being. The danger arises when the ego tries to regain control. Whispers, "You're losing yourself, you're going crazy, you're too alone." It's the old identity's last attempt to maintain dominance. Hill said the ego is a survival force that hears silence, because silence dissolves the lies that sustain it. When the awakened give in to this voice, they return to their old life, safe, predictable, but empty. When they face it and move through the fear, they discover something most will never experience, the point of no return. The moment the mind stops fighting the flow of life and begins to move with it, it is the birth of true freedom. But the crossing doesn't happen without a struggle. There are nights when the silence weighs so heavily it feels physical. The heart beats fast, the mind races aimlessly, doubt screams, "What if all this?" Hill believed this is the ultimate test of the. He called it the night of awareness, the moment when the individual must trust the unseen, even without any guarantee. It's a different kind of faith, not religious, but rational. The faith of those who have already understood that everything is cause and effect, vibration and response. In this state, fear still exists, but it loses power, because the mind finally realizes it can observe it without it. This is the turning. Fear ceases to command and becomes merely information. As this new perception solidifies, something extraordinary happens. Emotions calm, the body feels lighter, time slows down. The awakened individual begins to feel a connection with nature they had never noticed before. The sound of the wind, the movement of the trees, the cycle of the seasons. Hill said, this is the moment the mind aligns with the universal rhythm. The individual realizes there is no separation between themselves and the world. Everything is connected, and this awareness completely changes the way they live. The need to prove, compete, or convince disappears. In its place, emerges a new form of power, the silent power of presence. But there's a curious paradox. Just when the awakened person begins to feel peace, the world calls to them again. Friends reappear, opportunities resurface, responsibilities demand a response. It's as if the universe is testing whether they've truly learned to remain centered. Hill saw this as the second cycle of learning, the symbolic return to the battlefield, but now with a new awareness. The difference is that the individual knows they act with intention. Every word, every choice, every movement carries purpose. They understand that power lies not in withdrawing from the world, but in remaining whole within it. However, the transition between silence and return is delicate. If the awakened person rushes, they lose balance. If they delay too much, they stagnate. Hill used to say that the right time for action is revealed by inner. When the mind is truly ready, coincidences begin to align the paths. An unexpected invitation, a chance encounter, a sudden idea, everything seems to conspire to move. It's the sign that the cycle of retreat has fulfilled its purpose, and it is then that the understanding comes. Isolation was not a waste of time, but the ground where the new consciousness was sown. But before leaving, there is one final twist. Many report a moment when everything seems seated anew, new doubt, a feeling of emptiness after clarity. Hill said, this is the return reflex, final test before stabilization. The ego tries to rebuild the old says, you need security. You need recognition. You need to be someone again. And the awakened must respond with silence, not resistance, it is acidity. They know that true value comes not from external approval, but from internal coherence. When this understanding takes hold, the cycle ends. It is at this point that the mind becomes a precise, almost supernatural instrument. The awakened realize they can influence reality not through force, frequency. Clear thoughts attract clear circumstances. Balanced emotions generate fluid pathways. Hill saw this as the supreme mastery of the mind, the state in which a person ceases to be effect and becomes a cause. He observed that people who reach this vibration often reported impossible coincidences, affairs that resolved themselves, answers that appeared instantly, solutions created before the problem even arose. He called this the automatic response of the universal mind. But the true miracle lies not in these external phenomena. It lies in the inner serenity that arises when the individual realizes nothing more needs proving. Hill asserted that a harmonious mind is like a lake on a windless day. It reflects the sky without distortion. This serenity is not apathy, mastery. The awakened do not flee from chaos. They move through it calmly, because they understand that everything is a temporary expression of something greater. And when this understanding becomes vivid, the fear of loss disappears. The mind finally feels at home, even amidst uncertainty. Then comes the most surprising moment. After the entire journey, the awakened person realizes isolation. They understand that they withdrew from the world only to return different. Solitude was the furnace where the metal of consciousness was melted. Now they can walk among those who sleep without losing their glow and hear the noise without swept away by it. Hill said this is the point at which the individual becomes master of their own mental. They no longer seek influence, but radiate clarity. They no longer try to change the world, but transform it by their mere presence. What the world calls disappearance, Hill called reconstruction. The mind that passes through the night of consciousness is reborn with a new purpose, to exist as a living example of the silent power of lucidity. And this power, once awakened, can no longer be contained. That is why after this phase, nothing is ever the same again. The awakened no longer belongs to the old system of automatic reactions. They become part of a new, invisible order, that of those who have learned that true mastery lies not in controlling others, but in controlling themselves. And in the silence after the chaos, they realize they have not disappeared from the world. You have simply ceased to be captive. There comes a moment when everything makes sense. The silence, the losses, the isolation, the discomfort. Everything reveals itself as an invisible plan driven by the very intelligence that inhabits the human mind. Napoleon Hill said that true awakening does not end when a person withdraws from the world, but when they return to it without losing consciousness. This is the culmination of the journey, transforming what was discovered in solitude into practical, living, tangible light. The awakened person does not remain a distant observer, but they return, but now in a different way. Every gesture, every thought, every word carries a new weight, a new value. They understand that nothing they experienced was punishment, and that pain was merely the method of evolution. The mind that suffered, struggled, and rose again now understands that it can live without fear. Because it has mastered the essential principle, reality responds to inner vibration. But what does it mean to apply this to everyday life? It means not allowing external noise to determine your internal state. Hill taught that all creation begins in the mind, and that thoughts are invisible causes producing inevitable effects. Applying awakening is transforming observation into discipline. It's choosing what to think, what to feel, and what to nurture within yourself, even when the world seems chaotic. It's replacing reaction with mastery. Life will continue to offer challenges. Awakened learn to see them as exercises in consciousness. Each obstacle ceases to be an enemy and becomes an instrument of improvement. When fear arises, they observe it. When the urge to flee, they breathe. When doubt tries to dominate, they remember that silence is the tool of the mastermind. Hill said that victory belongs to those who master their own attention, and this is where learning becomes a living practice. Learning to direct attention is learning to create. It's easy to get lost again. The world keeps spinning fast, offering distractions and promises of belonging. But the awakened, now conscious, knows that true belonging isn't found in a group, but in harmony with one's own mind. One can return to being among people, but doesn't blend into unconsciousness. One can talk, work, love, but without losing oneself. He'll believe that the sign of true spiritual growth is simplicity, the ability to live in the same world, with same people, without being absorbed by the same illusion. And this simplicity is passivity, wisdom. The serene mind observes, decides, and acts. It doesn't fight the world, but it doesn't submit to it either. It learns to be like water, flexible, yet unbreakable. It's at this point that life changes. The awakened mind begins to attract different experiences. What once seemed coincidental now appears coherent. Situations reflect the inner state with almost immediate accuracy. New people appear, aligned with the same purpose. Work begins to flow more creatively. Decisions, once heavy, become light. Intuition becomes more reliable, and the body responds with health and vitality. Hill said that the disciplined mind transforms energy into opportunity, and this phrase sums up the secret of recovery. It's not about living isolated from the world, but about living awake within it, maintaining one's balance even when everything around seems out of balance. The awakened understand that harmony is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of coherence. With each dawn, he begins to recognize that true power lies not in what is achieved externally, but in what is sustained internally. He no longer needs to prove anything, nor convince anyone. You live the truth you have discovered, and that alone radiates transformation. And the curious thing is that this influence spreads silently. A calm gaze can change the environment. A word spoken with awareness can alter the course of a day. A decision made without fear can inspire dozens of others to do. Hill believed that the awakened become a creative force disguised as an ordinary person. They walk the streets like everyone, carry within them the seed of a new. But there's something the world needs to understand. Disappearance is not the end. It's the prelude to reconstruction. The awakened don't disappear forever. They return different, lighter, truer. Hill compared this movement to the hero's cycle, stepping away to find power and returning to share it. And this sharing doesn't require grandiose words or it happens in the subtlety of everyday life. Patience in the face of chaos, and kindness amidst haste, and the courage to be authentic even when everyone else is pretending. The awakened know that example is the deepest language of the soul. And when they live coherently, even in silence, they teach without needing to explain. Applying what has been learned means taking responsibility for one's own. It is impossible to change the world while vibrating like it. Hill taught that the human mind is a transmitter and receiver of frequencies, and that all true change begins with what is emitted. Thinking consciously, feeling conscious, acting consciously. This is the true creative power. When the awakened understand this, they no longer seek 1,001. They begin to live in alignment with visible cause, disciplined thought. The same thought that has moved inventors, healers, leaders, and all those who have silently transformed history. The path lies before each of us watching now. There are no external teachers, no ready-made formulas. There is only the invitation to look within, silence the noise, and discover the intelligence that has always been there, waiting to be heard. Hill said that the greatest discovery of all is to realize that we can choose what to think. This choice, simple and invisible, the beginning of true freedom. This is how the world changes, when one mind at a time decides to awaken. Perhaps that's why you're here, listening to these, because on some level you've already begun the process. Perhaps you still feel fear, confusion, loneliness of the path. But remember, every discomfort is a call. Every silence is an instruction. Every separation is preparation. You're not losing the world. You're learning to create it anew from within. So before this video ends, make a silent commitment to your own. Decide that starting today, you will think different. You will choose clarity over fear, presence over haste, purpose over distraction. He'll believe that every great transformation begins with a decision, and that the power of that decision multiplies when it's backed by action. So, start now. Write in the comments what touched you most in this video, even if anonymously, even with a single word. Share your process, inspire others to begin. And if you feel this content speaks to your soul, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Not to follow me, but to follow yourself on a deeper journey of consciousness, lucidity. Because awakening is not a destination, a way of life. And as Hill said, he who learns to master the mind, masters the universe itself.